Our first speaker will be Kassymkhan Kapparov. Kassymkhan is the director of the National Bureau for Economic Research of Kazakhstan, based in Almaty. He received his MBA from Yokohama National University in Japan, where he was an IMF scholar there. And he was also, as I said at the beginning, a research fellow at the Soros Foundation Kazakhstan Public Policy Initiative in 2014. And he will be presenting about a very critical topic for Kazakhstan, the invisible public debt. So, Kassymkhan.
Thank you for this opportunity to present today on the topic invisible public debt. Invisible public debt, the case of Kazakhstan. Majority of oil-rich countries end up in more debt after the oil boom. For example, Latin American countries faced debt crisis in 1980s after the oil price collapse. Today, 30 years later, these countries spent 1/3 of their export revenues for their interest payments, and foreign creditors owe half of their GDP. This year, Kazakhstan celebrates 25th anniversary of its independence. I'm interested in this topic because I think that invisible public debt will define the economic development in Kazakhstan for the next 25 years. My interest is last 15 years were a classic oil boom period in Kazakhstan. Every second dollar that the country earned during this period was coming from oil exports. I'm also interested in this topic because of the research that I did on the National Oil Fund for the last 2 years. National Oil Fund is seen by the government as a guarantee of its macroeconomic stability and also as a collateral for the public debt and the debt of state-owned companies. Invisible public debt is the debt of state-owned companies that they borrowed from abroad and in foreign currency. On paper, this debt is not accounted as the government's debt. Official economic programs and policies does not account for this debt, and they don't include the risk of the insolvency for the state-owned companies. As a result, government is not ready to face the problem. There are no reserves in the state budget for this case, and there is no clear plan on what to do if this issue, to deal with this issue. So my research question is why the invisible public debt accumulated by state-owned companies should be recognized as part of the government debt. To answer this question, I analyzed state-owned fund Samruk-Kazyna and two state-owned companies with the largest debt. Samruk-Kazyna is 100% state-owned fund that was created in 2008 to implement anti-crisis measures, develop infrastructure, and diversify the economy away from oil. It manages over 500 entities that varies from airlines, postal services, banks, to telecom and pipelines. Samruk-Kazyna's debt to EBITDA ratio stands at 5. It means that current debt amount is equal to the revenue of the next 5 years. Last year, debt grew by 10%. 80% of this debt is in foreign currency, while revenue is mostly in local currency, which has lost half of its value during the last year. Samruk-Kazyna has conflicting goals. On one hand, it has to increase efficiency of its companies. On the other hand, it has to support government programs and development and state programs. On pocket change money, Samruk-Kazyna is also funding the image-conscious activities of the government, such as Asian Winter Olympic Games, Astana bike racing team, middleweight champion of the world Gennady Golovkin, and Expo World Fair in Astana next year. My colleague and right scholar from Kazakhstan, Sabina Insibayeva, will provide more details in her interesting presentation. State-owned companies always have strong ties with the government. For example, Samruk-Kazyna's CEO is a former deputy prime minister, and most of the top management are members of the cabinet, former members of the cabinet. Just a few weeks ago, the head of another state-owned fund, Bayterek, has exchanged his seat with the Ministry of Economy. No surprise that the government sees state-owned companies as its second budget to implement social programs, and it leads to inefficiencies and corruption. State-owned company with the largest debt is national oil company Kazmunaygas. Kazmunaygas is a national oil company that accounts for a quarter of domestic oil production. Despite the high oil price period, the company accumulated over $20 billion debt. Currently, 100% of its earnings goes for interest payments. In July last year, government had to step in and provide $4 billion from the national fund to Kazmunaygas to reduce its debt levels. The National Oil Fund was created in 2001 with the mission to decrease oil dependency of the economy and to serve as a future generation fund. Instead of that, now National Oil Fund became a holder of 10% share in inefficient, highly indebted oil company, state-owned oil company. In addition, to cover its debt payments, Kazmunaygas sold its subsidiary in Romania for $1 billion, for which it previously spent $4 billion. Moreover, recently Kazmunaygas signed a deal to receive a $3 billion prepayment for future oil exports from its stake in Tengiz oil field, and this money was also spent for debt payments. No revenues are expected from Kassymkhan oil field, which is a high-cost offshore oil production site turned into a white elephant. This project is also called cash oil gun for a reason. At oil prices lower than $100 per barrel, at this oil production at this oil field will only generate losses. Privatization cannot help Kazmunaygas to generate enough cash to cover its debt. Currently, only 58% of the company is owned by the state. And the company has low valuation due to its non-investment rating. Summarizing, this company, Kazmunaygas, is not capable of generating enough cash to cover its debt payments. And the government has already stepped in to provide support. I expect that this situation will continue. Another company with substantial debt that I have analyzed is National Railroad Company, Kassymkhan. Kassymkhan is the largest employer in the country. It employs over 150,000 people. It accounts for 1/2 of cargo traffic in Kazakhstan. And the transportation cost is reflected in all goods consumed and produced in the country. Over the last 10 years, the company has generated $6 billion debt, half of which is in foreign currency. The company has been investing aggressively to fulfill government's agenda on infrastructure development. Currently, the company's debt to EBITDA ratio stands at 5, which means that revenue for the next 5 years, it will take revenue for the next 5 years to repay its debt. Most of its revenue is generated inside the country and it's in local currency. Last year, revenues dropped by 12%. In addition, the company cannot increase prices for its services because it will automatically lead to price increase in the country and it will decrease the competitiveness of local producers. 3 weeks ago, government stepped in and provided support to Kassymkhan to repay its $350 million debt. This money came from pension fund and it was in local currency. Therefore, the currency risk was moved from inefficient state-owned company to the future savings of people of Kazakhstan. No public or parliamentary discussion was held on that matter. To summarize this company, Kassymkhan faces a high risk of credit cliff due to decline in its revenue and non-investment rating. I expect government to continue to provide support to this company. All rating agencies assigned high ratings to the debt of state-owned companies based on one assumption: extremely high likelihood that the state will provide sufficient and timely tangible support when needed. I have presented 2 cases when the government had to step in and support these companies, state-owned companies. First, government has provided funds to Kazmunaygas from National Oil Fund. Fitch agency called it a clear reflection of the state support. Second, 3 weeks ago, government used public funds from the pension fund to repay the debt of Kassymkhan. However, in January, Prime Minister, in his reply to parliamentary request, said that the government, as a major shareholder of Samruk Kazyna, will not be responsible for its debt. Large portion of the public debt in Kazakhstan remains invisible to general population. Government avoids taking the responsibility for this situation and is not trying to prevent further increase of this debt. This debt was accumulated during the last 10 years, and it will define the economic well-being of people in Kazakhstan in the long-term future. If no measures are taken today, then the current government of Kazakhstan will pass on not savings but debts to the next generation of people. This will seriously damage the country's ability to have a substantial economic development, a sustainable economic development. My recommendations for the government include 3 major steps. As a first step, government needs to recognize this problem. It should include invisible public debt to government's economic policy agenda. For that, working group on the debt of state-owned companies should be created and headed by the Prime Minister. Second step is to stop further increase of the invisible public debt. Government has to put a cap on the total debt of Samruk Kazyna and its individual companies. Third, and the most important step, is to put the invisible public debt under control. The debt of state-owned companies should be included in the budget process and be approved by the Parliament. Thank you for your attention.